I'm joined now by Justin Glawe. Justin, you've been watching Georgia very closely as the state election board continues to be involved in litigation. There was a major court decision that was just handed down. What happened?
Yeah. So a judge essentially dismissed a lawsuit brought by Democrats that sought to remove the three pro-Trump members of the state election board, and in doing so, kind of killed any efforts that might hold them accountable as they continue to institute rules that will mostly affect the counting of votes in November.
So first off, the question I want to know is who represented these pro-Trump MAGA acolytes in court?
That would be Attorney General Chris Carr. And what's interesting about this is that Chris Carr is actually, he represented Kemp, Governor Brian Kemp, in filing a motion to dismiss what was an ethics complaint filed by a Democratic state legislator and a couple other people. So Carr represented Kemp in saying, hey, look, we have no power. Brian Kemp has no power to remove these these pro-Trump SEB officials because of this ethics complaint. Chris Carr is also defending the SEB in another lawsuit brought by Democrats that seeks to throw out some of the kind of election denier-based rules that the SEB has passed. And the contradiction there is that Carr himself has said that some of those recent rules, they shouldn't have passed them. They're outside the authority of the state election board and potentially against Georgia election law. So some irony and contradictions going on here that really sort of defy explanation at this point.
Right, and that's the contradiction that I was getting at here, because Chris Carr and Brian Kemp both openly oppose these rules that were passed by these MAGA members of the Georgia State Election Board. So why are they then going in a separate lawsuit to defend the same people who passed these laws in court and doing so successfully?
Well, I think the short answer to that is that Carr is technically the lawyer for the state election board, just as he's the lawyer for really any state of Georgia government body or office, right? I think he has the ability to tell the state election board, hey, you guys got to defend yourself. That has happened in other states where attorneys general have decided not to represent offices like secretaries of state, for instance, in Arkansas, in various election and voting rights related litigation. The contradiction, I can't really explain it. But the short answer is that he's technically the state election board's lawyer. And so therefore, when they get sued, he represents them and defends them in court.
Well, he didn't need to defend them so successfully if he was actually opposed to these rules, which it seems, based on the myriad quotes that I've read from him, basically explaining why the rules that they passed, these crazy rules that the Georgia Election Board have passed, shouldn't stand, for him to then not only just go and defend them in court, which I understand may just be his obligation by virtue of his position, but to then defend them successfully to the point where their continued presence on the board is basically guaranteed, kind of defies logic and signals that something is off here, either between Carr and what he's saying out loud, or just or something beyond that. To be clear, though, is this final, that the pro-Trump MAGA members of the Georgia State Election Board will then remain on this board throughout the election?
My reading of it is no. And here's where there's another super interesting and confusing wrinkle to this whole thing. So a judge dismissed the lawsuit, essentially trying to remove these members of the board. Prior to that dismissal, Brian Kemp filed a motion to dismiss the lawsuit, which again sought to have Brian Kemp remove the pro-Trump members of the state election board. And obviously, it was Chris Carr that wrote that motion to dismiss. And in that motion to dismiss, essentially, Carr said, look, Kemp's office doesn't really have the legal authority to institute administrative hearings to consider whether or not to remove these members. However, there are three possibilities for who can institute those hearings. One of them is the state election board itself, which probably isn't going to happen because this is the majority of the board, these three members, because
Right.
5 members of the board. Another body or office that could institute these hearings and remove them is Georgia's Inspector General. And the final person who could institute these hearings to remove the members is, and Chris Carr said this in the motion to dismiss that he filed, is Chris Carr himself. So it leaves open the possibility that that the Inspector General or Chris Carr as the Attorney General could institute hearings to remove the members. And so, the question now is, will he? And that's something that I guess we'll just have to wait and see. But it certainly doesn't look right now like he has the willingness to do that.
Right. Does this lawsuit have any bearing on the other litigation that I was alluding to before regarding the legality of their rule demanding a hand recount of all ballots, or is that litigation still pending?
That litigation is still pending, and that's the contradictory thing that we mentioned, because in prior to passing that rule, which came on a day when the state election board heard 11 rules that were proposed almost entirely by election denial activists, Chris Carr wrote a letter to the state election board essentially saying, like, pretty much all of these rules are outside the scope of the authority that the state election board has. And in the case of the hand count rule, appeared to be in direct contradiction with Georgia election law. And as we've said, he's now defending that rule in court. And the analogy that I think of is, like a district attorney or a prosecutor essentially saying that police had violated a criminal suspect's civil rights when they arrested him. And then, even though they don't believe potentially that the person should be taken to court, then prosecuting that person anyway. And so
Right.
it is a contradiction. It's a little strange that court is, or that case is still pending. And, maybe he'll slow walk it. Maybe he will not vociferously defend it or something like that. But as it stands right now, Chris Carr is defending the very rules that he said should have no merit and should not have passed.
I know it's kind of impossible to ask you to get into the heads of the people involved in this process, but do you have any indication as to whether at the end of the day, this rule is likely to stand? I mean, this rule, by the way, would result probably in ballots not even being fully counted and the election not being certified, certainly not on election day, but probably for a few days after, if they're actually going to go ahead and recount 5 million ballots in the state.
Right. My read is a little bit different than I think what some other folks took from the last hearing on this lawsuit, which was like a week ago or something like that. I think that this rule probably will stand. And the reason that I believe that is because in the last hearing on this, the judge essentially asked both sides, the Democrats and the Republican side, essentially being represented in the form of Chris Carr's office. Hey, do you guys both agree that certification of results is mandatory and that there is a certification deadline that counties have to meet, whether they are done hand counting the ballots or not? And both sides said yes, because that's what the law says. The Georgia State Election Code says that, there is a deadline for certification. And so what I took from that is that the judge is saying, well, look, if there's a deadline for certification, who cares what this hand count rule says or does, or really what any of these rules say or do, because these counties have a statutory obligation to abide by the certification deadline. So whatever happens before then, it doesn't really matter because they have to meet that deadline. And if they don't, the judge is right in pointing out that there are recourses for compelling them to finish up with certification. And potentially there are also workarounds for the Secretary of State to say, hey, look, if Fulton County isn't done, technically counting the ballots, or they haven't certified, we know what the votes are in Fulton County, so we're going to take them and add them into the statewide tallies anyway. So that's why I think this hand count rule will stand. The issue and the problem in my mind is that it will cause delays and in terms of the counting of votes, and whether the Secretary of State says, I don't care if you guys aren't done, I'm taking Fulton County's votes and putting them in the statewide tally or not, or whether there's writs of mandamus to compel the counties to finish the count and certification. The delays will be used, in my opinion, by election deniers to say, oh, look at all these problems, look at how long it's taking them because there was X number of ballots and that there was 5 more ballots than there were voters who checked into a polling location. And so it's that sowing of distrust and that starting of a political narrative about fraud and irregularities in addition to the delays that is potentially really problematic.
Bingo. That's exactly it. I think it's the point that while the court might not be worried or concerned about what's going to happen in that period, because ultimately they'll get what they want in terms of a certification on time, it is the rest of us who already know what happens when Republicans have this delay that they can exploit to just fill, like that vacuum that they can fill with just disinformation and claims about ballot stuffing and votes in suitcases and just use all of that time to basically sow distrust in our election. And that's obviously the last thing that anybody wants, other than, of course, the people who are likely to lose the election and want to sow distrust to benefit themselves politically. Justin, where can we read more from you?
I write a Substack newsletter called American Doom. It's at american-doom.com.
All right, I'll put that link on the screen and also in the post description of this video. Thank you for staying on top of this beat and appreciate you taking the time.
Thanks.